Hello everyone, today we introduce medieval Indian warfare. A couple of months ago I made my first video ever about medieval Indian warfare. I made other stuff about medieval Indian warfare, which is sort of odd given that we did cover medieval Asian warfare for so many regions and the Indian subcontinent had never been touched in that sense. I actually made lots of, especially Mughal warfare videos. We talked also about the Mauryas, so there is a fair amount of modern and ancient Indian warfare content on Schwerpunkt. We have really to enter a bit more into the medieval part. Of course, as you have understood also from the general series that I make, it's not like I'm covering medieval Asian history in this enormous... I do it to some important degree of depth, also considering the different level of documentation that I always point out in my diachronic and comparative approach. I think it's very important because when you do look at all these different regions, but also in a fair amount of depth, you immediately realize more or less how and why we have certain amount of information or not. Actually, I plan to always stick more a bit to the Western side of the eye, if anything, not because, say, I may have some broader ideological reason for doing so, but it's just because as a Westerner, of course, I also just know more about that. And in general, we know more in absolute terms about the West. So I think it is perfectly normal. It's not like I don't want, however, to expand into other continents. I started from relatively few to make a bit some more American in general content, not much the so-called Native Americans. I will stick to the term Indians, that today we talk about the actual Indians. Just a bad joke. But we talk, as you know, also a fair bit about Africa as well. Never talk about Oceania, as a matter of fact, but, you know, let's not put limits to providence. But chit-chat aside, medieval Indian warfare is really big, all right? Because we're talking really a subcontinent, and we're talking about an importantly civilized area, especially in the northern part of it, that had sort of almost a bridge function together with Persia between Europe and China as a broader civilizational trail, so to say. We start today looking at the fundamentals. We'll concentrate mostly on, given this is part of the original warfare series, just the fundamentals a bit from the earlier times, but mostly guiding into like the heart of the Middle Ages, like the 11th to the sort of later, probably centuries of the Middle Ages that are also better documented, of course, right? So in medieval times, when you look at India, you also realize that it had a very important political and cultural influence all along, right? As I was saying before, this bridge function did bring to things like, for example, our so-called Arab numerals that actually derive from the Indian ones. We have seen, and we'll keep seeing also in for antiquity, the importance of the European mercantile presence along, especially the Indian coastline. Think about the temple of Augustus in Malabar in Roman times to reach China from there. In medieval Europe, like mostly the latter would remain, in fact, the main sort of attraction for Westerners throughout the millennia. Indian influence, however, touched, understandably, many regions in the immediate surroundings, as much as India was notoriously influenced by these and also more faraway ones as well, basically touching nearly every shoreline of the Indian Ocean, that, as you know, is pretty extended, both latitudinally and longitudinally, becoming, as you know, also a vehicle for Islamic spread for up to Southeast Asia. In fact, really, Indo-China too was very influenced by Indian warfare to an extent. Far from In fact, acting as an obstacle, the Indian Ocean facilitated the movement of people and ideas, including the spread of military technologies that we're aware of, at least. At the core of this intricate web of cultural interactions lay probably the Indian subcontinent in its might, alongside of course, the island of Ceylon, of Sri Lanka, which founded colonies, by the way, trading posts, and potentially even imperial holdings in distant locales such as Burma, so Myanmar, and the East Indies. Now that I remember it, I think in the first year of Schwerpunkt I made a video about medieval India as well. We talked a bit about this in very simple outline, just mostly like the most important civilizations existing in this space. That's also why we call this as a whole a subcontinent. There are many different groups here. On the eastern edges, for example, the peoples of modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia were important. That's why we actually attach those to this video, because, again, it's a broader panoramic overview of the region. Some of these peoples would end up from Southeast Asia to literally establish settlements on the African island of Madagascar during the first millennium AD, interestingly enough, a sort of migration era at sea, and engaging in commerce as a consequence also with the African mainland, as we've seen just recently, for example, Abyssinian warfare, which was in turn, by the way, connected with India proper. We've seen it also in the videos about Mughal warfare, where many Ethiopian, probably black troops in Mughal service. Now, the impact of Indonesian settlers in particular on East African agriculture, particularly food crops, is well documented as well. There is evidence suggesting they also influenced the region's metallurgical practices, which is fascinating because it's not like the Indonesians were particularly more advanced than the East Africans, by the way. But this tells you also sort of the reach, like, so the broader, of course, this connection would have mostly happened transactionally through elites basically receiving influences from far and wide. And at that point, India would also be more impacting. It's at some point just a shade, a pattern we will see here and there. Nevertheless, it's remarkable. Also because, as we've seen, these regions in turn were very much connected with Europe as well. We tend to imagine, especially the medieval era, as a time where basically nobody traveled, where everything was sort of closed within itself. It wasn't at all, telling the truth. And especially the establishment was quite internationally active, even in, the early medieval times, the so-called Dark Ages, if of any darkness we can talk about. The contributions of Arabs, of course, as navigators, traders, and mercenaries was pretty much the main news after the Islamic invasions. This owed much, of course, to other cultures and civilizations as well, the Byzantine one, the Persian one, and others. Less recognized, however, is the existence of pre-Arab, and in some instances even pre-Semitic, indigenous populations along the Indian Ocean coast of Arabia. All right, this is also fascinating because you see that even regarding the latter region, there is not just a simple homogeneity. There are important differences, for example, between the western and the eastern coasts of Arabia. Mill's really wise. I made a video about Arabia as well. We partially addressed it. Many things were, as we will see now, going on also from the context with Central Asia, or better, the arrival of the Turkic Ghulams and Mamluks in these regions. Robust trade and settlement links connected Arabia with the East African coast. As we know from centuries, the Sasanians had tried to exert some power, as you know, on the Horn of Africa, and reaching basically the edges of the Punjab, or at least extending part of their influence so far east. We still have to cover the eastern Iranian region, and we talk about the western one, but there is a lot about that, especially the connections with Central Asia through Afghanistan, and a bit like a crossroad, as you know, of conquerors as far as the same early caliphates, but the Timurids and the Mughals that will take over India. A particularly striking feature of, by the way, the history of the Indian Ocean was the gradual diffusion of Islam across Southeast Asia, especially in the areas known as Malaysia and Indonesia, starting in the 13th century, probably, at least as far as we can see, but they would have happened even earlier than that. Some scholars say that this would have been, by the way, just a peaceful process, not much like it was, say, any religious spread was necessarily a peaceful one, but obviously if some elite had the enlightened to embrace a more universal sense of power stemming from the great empires of the era, of course, this is pretty obvious. Besides, this could help, in a sense, counterbalancing the influence of other religions at the time. And this depended, again, also on for example, the preeminence of certain ethnicities in the intercontinental trade. I mean, the Arabs, the Jews, they had done, right, a lot in those terms, and so they were more likely to spread also their cultural influence. All right, then things also in Southeast Asia got complicated, as we've seen in other videos. In any case, Islam provided with the pattern for some sort of local political strengthening in areas that were by the way, tendentially fairly primitive, fairly wild, and that did not spark excessively for political stability, telling the truth. So it was actually also a necessity at that point in history. In fact, despite these developments, we discussed the military history of medieval Southern and Southeast Asia remains underexplored. This is true also for India itself. I've never thoroughly entered into anything like Indian historiography itself. It's not like I don't know the language. I have no idea. I, generally speaking, see that probably that there is a similarity with other parts of the world that still have to basically develop the fully fledged, academic, sort of updated academic culture. And so there's really a lot, given that today India is literally the largest country in the world, demographically wise. And it was, say, civilized to an extent by the European rulers. However, say, historiography is something that requires a bit more time to be fully reliable, and especially starting to comprehensively and systemically browse a history that is immense. So that there's also a task that the Indians really have, and or for anyone that, of course, at this point in history can access more easily more sources, etc. I'm not pretending to contribute particularly to it, but I think talking about this on YouTube is important. I see at least some of the bigger channels tend to make, perhaps to win over, in fact, the Indian demographics in terms of views, etc., to make more Indian history of also some relatively more obscure medieval topic. Never really watched anything, but I know that it's a thing. There's something done in general for Islam, for example, as well. And so there is, of course, lots of more important pages that we have to cover ourselves. So let's be sort of self-indulgent. Let's give ourselves the time that it takes really to take on such enormous topics. We can say that while some scholarly focus has been directed primarily towards the establishment of Islamic authority in northern India, especially the Hindu kingdoms of southern India have received far less attention. this is also kind of obvious. I mean, incidentally, like even just before, of course, the Islamic conquest, the north of the subcontinent is where civilization lays, all right? And the south was much more savage in many ways, and in fact, there were also radical differences at times, and perceptions also blended in the broader Hinduistic tradition, the Vedic legacy. So there are very interesting blends when the Muslims arrive. And naturally, the Muslims arrive from a background that, again, we're with to see this from, especially like a Western perspective, was sort of much more similar to Europe's, given, again, the overwhelming influence from the Roman Empire, from the Persian one as well. So it's something that was also better documented. Like, we know much better what, of course, the Muslims did, like at this point in some depth, than, I don't know, what we know about the Chinese, regardless of the importance at some point. Needless to say, Buddhist Sri Lanka was also less studied, as well as the territories once referred to as Greater India by some, which included this also pretty large geographical swathe of what are now Myanmar. So again, Burma, Indo-China, speaking of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and southern Vietnam as well, that we covered, by the way, as far as medieval warfare is concerned, plus Malaysia, Indonesia, we mentioned them here, and even to a lesser degree the Philippines. All right, and these regions were shaped both militarily and culturally, mostly by the Hindu and Buddhist civilizations emanating from India and Sri Lanka. So, at large, regardless of, in fact, the Islamic presence that probably again predated the 13th century, more better known conversions, was entering like a pretty intricate web of political and consequently military connections between all these peoples, also again across the sea. On the Indian subcontinent itself, however, we see in fact the best information regarding this enormous area. Islamic governance was fairly restricted, so that we can be more detailed. Islamic governance for a long time was actually restricted to a small portion of what is today's Pakistan. Prior to the eastward expansion of the Ghaznavids from the Afghan mountains in the early 11th century, Islamic control was limited to independent Arab-ruled emirates in Multan, Mansoura, we're essentially on the lower Indus plain, and Sindh. This is because essentially the previous Arab presence belonged to the time of the so-called Golden Age of Islam that was, say, quite florid time for some of these communities, mostly connected with international trade, but also one of relative stagnation and also political fragmentation that essentially brought Islam to have been affirmed by these early rulers. The Ghaznavids came from a different background, like a Central Asian one, an already Turkic influenced one as well, plus some, actually Indo-European element to it as well, in, again, ways that are a bit less, say, the Pashtuns, say, are of course Indo-Europeans, but I mean the styles of warfare that we're discussing today are sort of, in that sense, very, in fact, like a blend between the Persian and the Turkic tradition. At that point, they were quite close, especially in this area that blended mostly different styles of cavalry warfare. With which the Ghaznavids conquered the entirety of the Punjab and Ganges plain as far east as Kalinjar. So, showing essentially what the new sort of updated Islamic warfare was fundamentally about. Kalinjar, as you know, is pretty far east we're talking basically up to the same longitude where Nepal starts, right? So it's all like on the eastern sort of half of the Indian, at least of India as a whole. Their Ghurid successors further expanded Islamic territory through these further injections of horsemanship that, as we've seen also in videos about, I think I made about the 15th century, Islamic Indian cavalry, in fact, had sort of a pretty old tradition that continued also during the Mughals, that in fact didn't even look that different, like especially considering their originally Afghan abodes. Now, the Ghurids annexed essentially the rest of the Ganges plain up to the Gulf of Bengal. So basically, they took over like this is what mostly like ruling Indian dynasties had always nominally succeeded in doing, except of course India would swallow everything into that hypertrophic, mostly very, very privatistic and very feudal, regardless of the presence at the same time of some more subtle civilization. That system that, however, in fact, in the latter case tended to be rebooted from time to time, but always resinking in that difficult situation of having exhausted mostly the main forces that had taken over the land. This is very interesting because when you look, for example, at Western Asia, you realize that the Mamluk model was fairly successful. I mean, they also were at some point taken over by the Ottomans, who were sort of younger powers, also bred in Mamluk influence, but they had this way of constantly resettling slave soldiers. This partly happened in India too, but it seems like the stretches of the land were just by themselves swallowing that, and probably was also more difficult to simply call people in from there, but we shouldn't even be so categorical about it. Besides, the Ghurids also expanded further in, pretty significant areas to the south of India as well. At some point, the Mongols take over most of Asia. In fact, India is the only place that they wouldn't really be able to conquer. As you know, the Mongols disrupted the Islamic world in the early 13th century. The destruction of Baghdad was one of the greatest strategies in the history of mankind, especially culturally wise, because of all the treasures and the knowledge, properly the sources that had been treasured by the Abbasids as the depositories of the great Islamic orthodoxy. Islam's southern boundary in India at that point stretched roughly from the Gulf of Kutch along the Narmada River through the hills and to the coast north of Orissa. Thus, essentially from what is the Saurashtra and Gujarat to like Orissa is like a federal state of eastern India. Like the capital is Bhubaneswar. So again, maintaining more or less this longitudinal stretch of because simply, of course, the Indus and Ganges rivers were the most, like, as you know, the old areas of India, the cradles of millenary civilization that were the most obvious to conquer. Everybody had put their eyes on them since Alexander, and where most Indians had ruled from the most civilized part of the subcontinent. The so-called slave kings of Delhi, so basically Mamluks, right? Soldiers dynasties had emerged from the Ghulam business. And in fact, the subsequent Turkish dynasties as well, such as the Khaljis and the Tughlaqids, pushed the aforementioned frontier further south even, briefly dominating the entire peninsula except its southernmost tip. This is the peak of the great medieval civilization. So in India, you have the greatest extension of what was essentially the universal power of the era, and as a consequence, like as we've seen in any other region in the world, in the latter half of the 14th century, Black Death, but much more like the exhaustion of these states perennially warring against one another, brings to a pretty strong political fragmentation, as well as a strong Hindu resurgence, for the simple fact that, as we've seen powers would tend to revert to some sort of more landed, more sort of territorially limited and more localistic forms of power with the collapse of the great universal dream. As a consequence, also the Islamic hold on India was enfeebled by this. It's not like it disappeared, but the Hindu element that also consisted in some actually of the most noble, in fact, non-Islamic, for example, cavalry traditionally, India actually has, regardless of the terrible weather and also grounded many circumstances, a very strong equestrian tradition that had mostly been, in fact, also in the heavier sense, I mean, as opposed to the more step-like of that the Islamic one had represented now, it was actually a legacy of very olden days. Now, the military history of medieval Hindu India centers on several regions that, in fact, steadfastly resisted Islamic rule. So it wasn't just like the Muslims were simply lording over most of the country. The key among them were, in fact, the Rajputana and Gujarat in the northwest. That makes you also appreciate the fact that they were resisting impositions that, as actually big as they are, geographically speaking, were close to the gates from which the Islamic invaders had historically come from. Orissa, as we've seen in the east, and Kamar and Assam as well, in the same area, as well as Vijayanagara in the south. In fact, these regions were, although Hinduistic, never fully forming a coordinated, unified struggle against the Muslims. Right? Had they succeeded in that, of course, they would have probably also succeeded further. But they had their own problems, both internally and externally. Of course, the Hindus fought against one another, the Muslims fought against one another. In general, the differences were felt anyway. And in fact, there was no reason, paradoxically, even more when Islamic-controlled India was fragmented, especially in the later Middle Ages, to actually be too worried about that. All right, it's a matter of methods still. If there is a big invasion, you try to make a more solid front against it. Otherwise, it also blends in this pretty shady political gaming. The Hinduistic armies were largely drawn from, as we said before, the noble or warrior Kshatriya caste, which, as you know, is something that we often see also in the videos about traditional religion as far as the Vedic warriors were concerned. They supplied, as we've seen, the ruling elites. In some cases, they fought, of course, for the Muslims as well. Warfare was, however, something more expensive estates-wise, especially considering the enormous demographic potential of the country. So that Indian armies were actually quite composite and definitely quite interesting. We'll get better in detail some video about properly medieval Indian armies organization, their tactical segmentation, etc. We're at large talking about a sedentary culture, right? Plus, again, these Central Asian injections, but at large being very, very much similar to what it had, we can argue, always been. In the later medieval centuries, in spite of all the, in fact, religious implications of this, military texts of the Hindu tradition allowed for the appointment of highly capable generals, even from the lowest Sudra case, in response to pressing military needs. Right? I'm to make yet another video about how, in Indo-European tradition, of course, the Sudra are a bit like the plebeians. Like they were not considered men; they were considered humans, right? And simply because they did not belong to totems that had the ancestors of which had managed to made it into heaven. Ideally, then in practice, some degree of imperium were bestowed on these peoples as well. I also made a video about the rise and fall of Vedic religion, in which we explain how, of course, what we see from India today, from that very old tradition, is, however, something, and obviously very much degenerated, right, compared to the absolute Vedic principles that are not even just fully explicitated, in spite of the grandiosity of their, let's say, their centrality properly in Indo-Europeistics, right? And this is something that we know in the very moment in which they were written down, because by then, say, the Vedas strictly meant as a people, of which we don't even have, say, broad archaeological evidence, did not quite, in fact, exist anymore in a strict, cohesively ethnic sense. They had also been swallowed by the greater, mostly chthonic, feminine Indian mother to an extent. And of course, like the system was very syncretic, so that their tradition did survive technically in charge, but with such, for example, exceptions. As you see, modernization and secularization happen also in countries that are not as modern or secularized as others. Nevertheless, this practice was of allowing basically the lesser people of the fourth estate to the army, so with a recognition of even generals, so something that really entailed the bestowing of the imperium, was not adopted by some of the most elitistic polities, such as the aristocratic Rajputs of northwestern India, that probably consider themselves even closer to, even in a historical sense, to it's not just like the north and the south in terms of Apollonian and Chthonic vibes respectively, but also west and east as well. All right, you can't make it as just a matter of Indo-Europeanness, but obviously enough, like the more distant you go from the channels from which that warrior culture had arrived, sort of the more the more chthonic, in a sense, you become. The Rajputs of northwestern India were committed to repelling Turco-Islamic advances from the 11th century onward. So, as principalities devoted to that kind of holy war, they were pretty much characterized by also some ideological purity that there would have been exceptions for, but still. As a result, the defeat of the Rajput Kshatriya caste, by the way, often led to the collapse of their entire defensive framework. It's as if they had been like the Spartans of the situation. At the Thermopylae, maintaining a more elitistic lifestyle that in fact had also a more ferocious, as we've seen here, social, say, division, so with much more rigid castes, but in this sense, paying whenever, say, any major manpower loss in combat was suffered, as opposed to other polities that sort of adequated and co-opted lesser elements, if they deserved that, just by military capacity in their armies. The integration of Hindu mercenaries, including both cavalry and infantry, into the professional armies of the 10th and 11th century Islamic Ghaznavids indicates, as we were saying before, not just their reputation as formidable warriors, but also the fact that they would, of course, fight also under different commanders' religions. We have seen this, after all, very well in Europe, in the Mediterranean. There were Islamic guards used by, say, the Holy Roman Emperors, as well as Christian ones by various Islamic potentates in North Africa and Spain. Additionally, some recent converts to Islam, especially in the armies of Delhi, that was the state where that transition had most exemplificative of, likely retained traditional Indian tactics and weaponry. Right? It's not like religion simply changes the way you fight. India, again, is as you know, very, say, climatically and territorially diverse. Thus, certain specific capacities to approach certain terrains of certain weather is something just inherent local techniques. This is definitely evident also among non-Islamic Hindu soldiers serving Islamic rulers. They would adapt to that sort of for example, faster type of combat were they brought at any point outside of India, which didn't happen too often, but it's also not, it would have not been the first time in history. Think about the Indian mahouts that Pyrrhus brought to Italy. Although local forces made significant contributions, the armies of especially the Islamic northern Indians from the 11th to the 14th century were predominantly led by non-Indians or recent settlers, right? This was important. Again, the religious divide was deeply felt. It was just a social one. I mean, one people had been conquered by another. And while, as we've seen, this cooptation, especially of this quite numerous Hindu nobility, did exist in the armies, there was still a pretty clear division between the Islamic rulers and this Hindu subjects. Turks, including Khaljis and other of unspecified tribal origins, were, for example, likely the most prominent alongside Khitai, who may have been Karakitai or Mongol refugees. I made videos about this. This is very interesting because it shows how some Turco-Mongol, specifically Mongol elements, would have actually entered India at some point. These forces, were being unchained from the bowels of northeastern Asia, and they were some of the best fighters of the era, so they would have found their place also in India. References to Rum, even in similar sources, likely denotes, those ones, the Turks from Anatolia, right? This tells you also how intertwined the Islamic world was. In times where we tend, again, to think mostly everything was regionalized, we also mostly see from our, Western perspective, like the Seljuks of Rome coming so far west to call themselves after Rome, as if, all the pushes from Central Asia were directed to the west. But evidently they weren't, and some of these guys' lifestyles in the pastures of the Anatolian plateaus would have actually been conducive to still, in fact, a nomadic lifestyle. If there was an opportunity far east, these guys would have gone over to India. This was especially typical of the nomadic elements, the lighter ones, that would come from very, very far away places, even say in the times of the Crusades, to fight, for Saladin, etc., just because they had heard that in their rich places, right, in a fertile sanitary civilization, somebody was launching a massive campaign, and so that was a good chance to come to loot along the way. This is literally how all those swarms of horse archers that you see during the Crusades were compacted. Not only there were many locals, but they could become really also from pretty far away. It's even possible, considering also the videos that we have made about, in fact, the highly westernized profile of the Sultanate of Rome, militarily wise, and also later about the Osmanians, that there could have been even a few Europeans serving Islamic forces in India. The Firank, as they were called. We're talking Franks, Byzantines, that were routinely employed by the Seljuk of Rome, that at some point would have sent forces for some reason in the east and ended up in India. All right. Besides all kind of things that could happen. For example, we know that the Ilkhanate of Persia at some point used Frankish cavalry and Italian crossbowmen in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, right? So that's something. Ask Marco Polo. There were so many Europeans in China at that point, so you can easily understand how many would end up even in India. Ghurid mercenaries probably originated from, in fact, these regions like Afghanistan, the Khorasan, and Tajikistan as well. There was a broader, Iranian and Turkic blend, depending on which province in particular. there were also the so-called Chinese, right, that were likely either from China, in fact, or refugees from, as we've seen before, with the Hittite eastern reaches of the vast Mongol Empire that at that point was basically straddling the steppes, but was properly, as we've seen in the videos about the Kingizids, Chinese warfare, like ruling in China and Mongolia at the same time. It's interesting, by the way, that these guys would enter India from the west rather than from the east, to prove also how majestically powerful the Central Asian mountains, the Himalaya, massive, etc., were in dividing civilization. We, again, made multiple videos about Burma, Vietnam, etc., showing how the limits, the southernmost limits of the Chinese Empire, Tibet as well. So while there was a capacity to technically enter India, here they weren't exploited politically or strategically, if not by Central Asians. Right, the Chinese were sort of looking at a different theater or set of theaters. We're talking here, however, mostly war bands, especially as far as, immediately after the conquest, and any other connection that could have continued in the following years. Now, the pre-Islamic Indian military tradition was, as we know, well developed and in many ways very characteristic. Each military culture is unique. Like other so-called lost military systems, you could even say that they are partly documentable through later Muslim manuscripts, because we don't have from India the same level of, for example, scriptural practice that we see, for example, in the Islamic world. This is very important because they had that, but as you can see also here from the architecture, etc., it's not like they weren't advanced, but they were sort of often more degraded statally and sort of organizationally, so in a broader civilizational sense, to actually produce that same level of Western-minded literature, historiography that, after all, Islam had taken from the West, right? If you compare, again, the West to even, Persia, for example, it was more, that produced more compared to India, manuscript-wise. You immediately realize how sort of less documented that region is, as we also observed in the video dedicated to it. From, say, other videos we've made, for example, about the aforementioned the Mauryas, especially, you can get an idea just of what Hindu warfare from, say, by the millennia had been about, not just because it was Hindu per se, but because more or less India had remained like a fairly isolated basin on its own. It had not gone under radical changes. There was a lot of infantry, right? There is an emphasis in this also Islamic later sources talking about the previous system, about the role of footmen, in particular archers. We've seen it well in the videos about Mauryan warfare. There's even a sense that infantry was more important than cavalry. I personally challenge that. I mean, it depends really what we're talking about here. In open ground, of course, there were elephants, by the way. Those were actually maybe what was reducing the role of cavalry per se, but not like cavalry was, say, less important than infantry. I don't think that even India escapes the pretty universal rule that, especially from the migration era and onwards, but possibly even before that, in fact, quite likely before that already, cavalry was the prominent arm in Indian armies, together, say, including, if you want, elephants as well, but still, right? And this actually tells you even how sort of organized and logistically complex these military systems really were. In fact, the elephants are, beyond astronomical in terms of supply needs. And not just, again, in terms of feeding the elephant, but also needing, for example, to lodge them in particular areas, like to have enough food, yes, but also like enough space and, sanitary precautions for the rest of the army, etc. So we're talking about, again, very advanced military systems. The elephants were sometimes clad in armor, which is the thing you see also, I don't know, in some museum diorama about the Mughals, from which we have actual sort of full elephant armor, and this stuff existed also before. Mostly they had padded armor because otherwise the cost would have been insane. But we know that especially in late medieval times, as we observe also for cavalry in Western Eurasia and beyond, like there was a narrow, in fact elite, really all clad in metal, and it was again probably costing the finances of entire states, but still evidently worth it in the field. Consider that the same Muslims, especially in the eastern part of India, that was more prolific, in fact, in terms of elephants and elephant warfare, as opposed to the West, it was more, in fact, horse-based. Those Islamic armies did use elephants for ceremonial purposes. After all, also the Romans had, elephants depicted, pulling the chariots of the Indo-European heroes. So, why not? Right? There's nothing against Islam about that as well. Now, Indo-Indian armies maintained a traditional organization, though the adoption of Persian and Arabic terms suggests, of course, some exchange of ideas, to say the least. If anything, the latter shows you that is often what we see documented from the Islamic side, that provides with more documentation, is the obvious preponderance of the same Islamic military system, like the military system of the conquerors, over the Hindu one. Although surely adapting to the latter's organization as well. All right, these forces reportedly comprised the Maula, resident military elite. This was the name, so essentially it's the local nobility. Right. Then you have the mercenaries known as Britaka. Instead, the urban militias that also existed, because India has an old urban tradition, to say the least, were known as Shrenibala. So these were being the sort of third estaters that would be accepted as, properly, of course, an auxiliary force. Plus, there were probably some indigenous tribal forces, mostly having a sort of secondary role that, however, were useful, especially in scouting, tough terrain, etc. So they were more expandable. And you see here like a well, neatly outlined hierarchical organization. We also must consider that while the aforementioned Islamic texts are quite useful in this historical regard, many of them remained highly theoretical when we read strategy or warfare in general. We know it even just from our own Western traditions, and that they weren't written to actually describe what would literally happen, like in a comprehensive way. We're far away from that. And in particular, Islam was sort of more concerned with more like some more abstract, harmonious perfection. We've seen this in, for example, reading the sources of Crusades battles. Like the Western accounts are more like just, I don't know, a Greek or Latin historian of classical antiquity would criticize and analyze, whereas the Muslims follow some sort of more like things happened. They were influenced, as we've seen themselves, also by Western historiography. but they had a tendency towards more like the broader plenitude of the effect in a divine reading, like meaning why did this happen? Like even from the numbers of armies, for example, I don't know. It was said that 100,000 men fell in this battle, right? Or when Baghdad was razed to the ground. If I told you like how many people died there, you wouldn't even believe that. So I don't write. It's a chronicle. So this kind of effects that are shared also by other cultures, but that maintain some sort of different interests. And so for a place as far as India, that also does not produce very much by itself in that regard, it's a bit difficult to simply look at it. But if we stick to the information here, it's plausible and really matches with what an army of the time would have looked like. After all, again, it's not like in the essence this forces, nobility, mercenaries, militias, and even more ethnic tribal forces were something different from other armies across Eurasia, right? We're pretty much the same thing. If anything, we know that while strategy and military manuals remain highly theoretical, they still reflected a sophisticated military heritage that we perhaps better understand, also as we've seen in the recent video about the medieval Islamic Indian cavalrymen, from probably the techniques, like the archaeology of it, the type of weapons and armor that, especially from the Islamic side, in fact, is more widely documented, especially across Western Eurasia, to a degree that makes us understand also through the more critical account from the Western side what this warfare was more concretely about. India had a lot of syncresis. Some scholars suggest that the primary differences between ancient and medieval Indian armies were the phasing out of war chariots, and thus an increase in the role of cavalry, actually, if it hadn't been for the fact that elephants were still around. This is also kind of an obvious statement the scholars can make. Yes, there aren't war chariots anymore. It should be said, however, as we have observed in videos about ancient Indian warfare, however, that the subcontinent abandoned chariots fairly late in time in history, right? They were still there, say, centuries after Christ, in actual combat, which is relatively rare. But because we know that they had been phased out from, if anything, centuries before Christ in other parts, especially of Europe. But the point of, and Western Asia, by the way, but the point of this is that India had a lot of lots of people, lots of resources. They may have not been kept qualitatively kept together, so to say. In fact, again, India has this pretty tormented history of political compaction and then disgregation, etc., a bit like the Samshara, in the general tectonic cycle of nature of the devouring mother. That, from my observations of ancient Indian warfare, including chariot warfare era, my idea is that Indian cavalry was much stronger than we're usually crediting it for. I have this impression really on my own. Again, I would like to research more Indian warfare in especially ancient medieval times to confirm this intuition. In any case, we see there are many reasons for that. Again, you can watch the videos I already made, but there is this persistent, regardless in fact of this wide array of arms, right, including again the elephants that really did present like some sort of important complement to mounted warfare, to say the least, and chariot warfare even in antiquity, like this persistence in the in references to nobiliar warfare, and mostly fought mounted. Again, in antiquity, also like in the Middle Ages, they could do so through elephant warfare other than chariots. But say, when we look at medieval times, which culture do you really know in Asia or in Eurasia that did not have a cavalry preponderance over infantry. I don't think it makes much sense to want to cross India out of this. By the 11th century, the Indian armies typically consisted of a small, well-trained and well-kept elite, which is exactly the one I'm referring to from the military case on horseback. This is typical for, by the way, the times and the places, because it's just like in Europe. If you look at numbers, how many were really heavily armored knights on horseback? Actually, were pretty few compared to the rest of the army, but we all know how important they were and that they constituted the stronger arm. So this could easily happen. Again, you see, because we don't have explicit, like, you can't study Indian history like reading Western chronicles, all right? It's just not there. There's a major gap. But again, why should we think otherwise, right? The same thing of like large numbers of poorly trained infantry that otherwise we do see in Indian warfare is just like something you can see in and not even necessarily poorly trained. As we've seen, there were urban militias that would have counted something. And again, even if the large majority were peasant conscripts, like also in China, there were some things like that. But this doesn't mean that the local armies were ill-trained. There would have been rota systems. There would have been ways to simply optimize the recruitment and the army's efficiency. So again, I'm prone to think that there was some, maybe, I'm not saying that cavalry warfare was extensively dominating in the form of properly of numerical involvement. Like if you look at, in fact, the essentially Turco-Mongol tradition that spreads also in India from this point onwards, in through also the Islamic world. Of course, cavalry was important also because it was more numerically preponderant, but in the form of horse archers, for example. The Indians didn't have quite much of that. They surely had the horse archers because everybody had them, but in ways like in the West, we could have them, right? In some sort of even picked troops that didn't make too much numbers and also were fundamentally missile troops, so not too important, right? So these were armies anchored on pretty solid, like, elephant logistics, so to say. This large amounts of infantrymen you could really throw infinitely at the enemy. Of course, not quite infinitely, but again, the backbone of this, even just from an operational, tactical point of view, must have been properly mastered by cavalry. I mean, it can't be otherwise. They may have been, again, less wieldy, or tendentially even heavier, possibly actually denoting some kind of greater cavalry importance. And there are, again, I don't know, in the jungle, cavalry is not that good, but that mostly pertains to sort of the southern areas of India, like the northern plains, regardless of some swampy areas and other wooded land. At large, cavalry would have been quite effective. Again, this is something we could come back on. Also, Alexander had problems with his cavalry in India, etc., but it's not like he was just entering all of India and just testing the broader system. Like, armies would have worked also in India. It's not like terrain or climate are this overarching force that simply stops entire armies on a regular basis, also because otherwise armies wouldn't venture there, like in the desert and in some of the most prohibitive mountainous spaces that could even be, by the way, tackled for that matter, as it's been proven also by Chinese warfare in Central Asia. That was really, really shocking, together with the Turco-Mongols as well. But also, in fact, as lighter, more agile troops, especially in the latter case. So such Indian armies were also often large. As such, they were slow to maneuver, but also they were more strategically preponderant. They were, as we've seen, pretty well organized and stratified according to the Hinduistic caste system. The Indo-Islamic armies themselves soon adopted a notable Hindu practice, for example, that is the strong focus on royal spectacle and the psychological or propagandistic aspects of warfare, which very much intertwined with this, for example, the show-off of how many elephants can you maintain. You can measure the power of Indian principalities on the base of that, up to fairly late in time, by the way. And that obviously entails like a deep, connection, like probably a substantial collection of local military practice. Again, India tends to basically wear everything out. Any kind of external force gets more or less absorbed and chewed. Like it does leave a trace, but it's at the end of the day quite obliged to adhere to the local system. Sieges dominated military campaigns, as far as we understand. So, talking about medieval warfare, it's unsurprising. Probably the reason why sieges are so prominently depicted is also a bit of a optical distortion due to the obvious fact, as we see also in the West, that these smaller encounters in India, given the lack of a strong chronicling tradition, would have been less evident. So that we literally just know the biggest campaigns that obviously gravitated around sieges, like just anywhere else at the time. But also for Western Europe, like if you watch certain YouTube channels, it seems as if medieval warfare were just many sieges and just major pitched battles every once in a very rarely, actually, according to them, whereas there was an enormous amount of operations in between in open field by smaller contingents that are just simply less recorded or less actually even studied by scholarship, which is another problem, actually. I am a great advocate also because in my doctoral research I dealt with a lot of that for, say, knowing better than simply minimizing how actually active Indian armies would have been, also outside, of course, of sieges. Outcomes were at some point described still as determined by duels between opposing champions, which is something that, frankly, is very literary and ideal. Again, the Indians were quite, again, into that Vedic legacy of representing everything like the hero that challenges the other, the good and evil, the white and black, etc. Literally. So they would have simply chronicled these military events as mythological sagas. Right? Hence this, like, heroic warfare, we think it never really truly existed, not even, I don't know, in the Bronze Age. There was always some retinue, etc. And we're looking at medieval armies, also in such big civilization like the Indian one. Of course, there were massive business of pretty big forces that probably also underestimate in terms of, if anything, of command control. Because at least that, as we said before, India had a lot of manpower and labor force for fielding large armies is kind of obvious. But there is also a sense that they may have been actually a pretty well-rounded military system that didn't really have problems. Like, I've never seen, honestly, in my military historical experience, let's say, any sort of major flow, civilizationally speaking, in how armies fought in history. Like, they mostly were always up to a certain level of standard competence. As we observed before, India was widely recognized for its archers since antiquity. Right, their bamboo bows long bows specifically were definitely a might to reckon with, which actually coming from a series about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, and looking at other sort of contexts in which longbow was used, especially considering the differences between sort of infantry and cavalry. In this case, infantry does not appear in India to have always been particularly strong in large numbers. I mean, they would have had something like that at some point, but my understanding is that missile power was mostly aimed to bog down cavalry, to eventually stop it with infantry or with other cavalry, of course, because mostly that's what Indian armies were about. In fact, most Indian archers were on foot, right? Horse archery, as we said, was also practiced, particularly in northern regions like Kashmir because of the obvious Central Asian influence. But in general, again, there would have been some smaller contingents in the Hindu tradition that would have fought mounted. So until the 13th century, when Turco-Islamic military influence surged, but had already brought since the early days of Islam, in fact, those also mostly Middle Eastern, Central Asian, more than else, influences, Indian horse archery bore greater resemblance to, in fact, earlier Iranian styles. This is fascinating as well because the greatest influence was not even, in fact, simply Turco-Mongol, but Persian. And this is yet the other very important element of this, that probably it was always a greater, connection historically between Persia and India, as opposed to India and Central Asia. It's not to say that it would have not happened. We covered enough Indo-Scythian history to observe that. But the big empire around had been the Persian one, and say that Persian military culture is more persistently close to India in some more elaborate fashion than Central Asian is. Central Asian one is. And also the Indo-Scythians at the end of the day would have actually been Iranians themselves. So again, not Persian, but akin more or less to the same peoples that made the Persian Empire, dynasty after dynasty. We will see this better again, but especially talking about Eastern Iranian military styles. As we have seen, the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids were Iranians at large, so that is yet another connection. While cavalry warfare had been more prevalent in northern India than in the south, and in this case mostly also because the south was poorer and less socially stratified, more, let's say, humid, more tropical. Since the 10th century, external observers such as the 11th century Islamic scholar al-Biruni claimed that Hindus were too arrogant and insular to adopt foreign innovations, which is an Islamic way for saying that actually Hindu civilization was pretty developed, so that there wasn't an immediate adoption of Islamic military styles as much as Islam could simply not take over the entirety of the country, nor simply erase the Hindu tradition at all levels of culture. Al-Biruni described specifically Indian tactics as outdated, in his opinion. He was a bit biased, I think. It's not to say, again, that the Muslims didn't actually have the upper hand and that did really conquer large swathes of India because of evidently the military culture that was effectively superior. However, here we're looking at sort of statements, at least, that should be a bit more carefully read. For example, the fact that Indian infantry was disorganized. Consider that he was writing in the 11th century, was, as you know, one of the greatest scientists of the Middle Ages, right? And he came, as many other prominent Islamic cultural figures, not much from, Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc. He came from the Khorasan, right? He was a Khwarezmian. That region was, as you know, a meeting point of so many different cultures and different lifestyles proper. So Turks and Iranians, sedentaries and nomads, Muslims and other, say, barely at least Muslim people. So that did stimulate a great deal of critical thinking. And so from that perspective, like the fact, of course, he also lived in the broader Islamic world, so he knew what, for example, the Syrian or, say, Iraqi infantries of the era were like. There were also Iranian groups such as the Dailimis that lived close to his homeland, near to the Caspian Sea that were still pretty darn good infantry troops. They were very warlike, and they still, like, as primitive mountaineers or actually hillmen as they were, they would still beat, say, the Turkic gulams all over the Islamic world, finding their employment far and wide, including likely also in India. So what here probably Al-Biruni means is that Indian infantry was numerous. I mean, it was disorganized because it was too numerous, or at least being too numerous, of course, its average was not too great, right? He also lamented the fact that the Indians over-relied over war elephants, their elite in particular. So it's as if to say that, again, they had neglected their cavalry tradition in function of the elephants. In fact, Al-Biruni is a bit like the voice that, you see, you have a historian that says this, of course, in very mediated contexts that you should also specifically try to interpret for what they were at the time, which is very hard, that, however, leave a mark on the actual, like, is the statement just unequivocally, I'm sure it's well-founded in many ways. I'm not making the point, as we've seen here, that the Muslims didn't have reasons to think that Indian warfare was somehow lagging behind compared to theirs. But in general, like, we know that there aren't so radical divides, especially between such civilized areas in terms of military quality or efficiency. One thing is saying southern India, yeah, that was objectively underdeveloped at so many levels. It's also less militarily effective. But even there, like, again, they fought in ways that made sense, right? So one cannot dismiss Indian warfare that way. There is also a sense by the 11th century that, of course, Turkic warfare in particular is dominant at this point, so horse archery, or what entailed that a specific equestrian military culture, was sort of the way to go. And it was about to be. Consider that here we don't make that story, but the same Islamic world had a general crisis. The end of the so-called Golden Age, and happened in parallel to the collapse of the great centralized bureaucratic sort of permanent military systems of Byzantine Persian imitation, like some relics of the ancient world. In India, something similar would have actually happened, at least not because they had that model previously, but surely there would have been an increase in privatization, in feudalization. That's also why the Turks take over at the end of the day, because there is some sort of shatter. That we've seen this also in the Byzantine Empire. At some point, that original public state was eroded. So it's possible that the Indians had upheld something relatively similar in intention, and they also were suffering this crisis that Islam was capable of capitalizing upon, especially if the Indian system was so literally pachydermic rather than leviathanic, to be so easily sort of punctured and taken advantage of. Right. So when we're looking especially at, from an Islamic perspective, the main criticism was about military technology, archery, cavalry, right? This, by the way, actually tells us that the Indians utilized both cavalry and archery in probably, quite traditionally effective and synergic ways, so that we don't have, again, any reason to think that India had remained simply isolated, also from the same Islamic tradition that, as we've seen up to this point, had also, however, upheld certain standards that were changing under the pressure. In fact, that's why Al-Biruni is important in his background, because he's not really coming from, I don't know, Baghdad, right, or Damascus, or Cairo, Cordoba. He's really looking at a different perspective, and this may have been extended on the this miscredence, by the way, as he would have seen. The tendency, as you understand here, is to actually probably reevaluate Indian warfare. Had it had like a greater voice on its own, we could have likely assessed it more clearly. There are indicators, however, that seem to point to some underdevelopment or general lack, if anything, of political cohesion that would produce military effectiveness. Some say that the Indians took a while before adopting stirrups, right? This may actually occur because of the elephant presence that wouldn't overtly develop cavalry maneuver and repeated cavalry charges, etc. Like possibly like this great Indian, Indian great landowners could have actually fostered instead of the elephants. So that may be a reason. By the way, the stirrups were introduced in India pretty early on. We've seen it also in the videos about the origins of stirrups. We know that the Indo-Scythians were pretty much ahead in that sense. That Iranian military tradition, again, had probably stuck to India as well, because we do see those guys, we're talking about a millennium before this, but still having some of the heaviest cavalries ever seen. And we know that just because of coins, basically. So that for saying how obscure, technically, our understanding of the whole system is, but if we find those indicators, they're not really random, also because in that case they were fairly unique. So we should be careful, even especially in my opinion, at belittling Indian cavalry culture. If Indian military technology was in some respects outdated, the same cannot be said, for example, of the metallurgical expertise that underpinned it. Right? Notoriously enough, the Indian subcontinent was blessed by the monsoons that are not just pretty powerful winds, but they have the peculiarity of being seasonally, like for 6 months you have that wind that blows always at that same flux, the same speed, the same direction, and that can thus insufflate the furnaces, right? If you wonder where the Indian woods still comes from historically, it's that. Like in Europe, we needed hydraulic pumps, like to insufflate oxygen in oven to reach the right high enough temperature in order to allow for the better blending of the metal composites. In India, they had it much earlier. We know that this is an incredibly important and interesting topic. I will make a video entirely dedicated to this at some point, obviously enough. The Islamic world at large was replicating some of these. It was not just about the monsoons, obviously. There were other factors, but if you think about Damascus, Toledo, right, these were the finest blades, at least by name. And we understand it was an important Indian connection, that India had been also as far, for example, as the same metal stirrup, right? Maybe not exactly quite as we should remember it, but let's say we understand that a lot of interesting things were happening technically wise there. And this is also a pretty powerful indicator of the fact that given that metallurgy at the time was mostly for the sake of warfare, of panoplies, that, again, those Hindu cavalry, man, were actually something that more interesting than we think. The Indian subcontinent formed by the way, as we observed at the beginning, the core of a triangular trade mark in which East Africa supplied raw materials, smelted iron ingots, and copper. The Indian smiths transformed the iron into steel ingots. As you know, this is in fact, exactly how it's processed in the aforementioned. At the certain temperatures, you have to get iron obtaining certain very specific, a few points percentage, but only within that specific range amount of carbon, right? And this confers the blade some certain very important characteristic, elasticity and resistance, etc. And the finished blades were, of course, exported again from India as well to places like Arabia. We've seen it in video about medieval Arabian warfare, possibly also Southeast Asia. Anything that fell mostly into that Indian Ocean trade circuit. Steel production, as we have observed with Damascus, occurred also in the Levant, almost certainly as a result of adopting Indian techniques. We don't have to necessarily think again that everything was happening because people copied one another just per se. Like probably like if there were the preconditions for these things to develop, they would have developed anyway. But again, there was knowledge as well. So surely, I don't know, some Syrian and Indian smith would have shared some secret regarding as far as these techniques that again are today we don't even consider in engineering that wrought iron basically as steel, right? But and of course we can create much better quality swords, but with the means of the time today, with our technology, we haven't the palest idea of how the hell they managed to pull that off. I mean, this is not a hyperbole. We literally have zero idea. Like these people had, of course, I mean, we know how swords were made overall, but how they reached that level of ergonomy, for how sort of if properly designed for combat those swords were, how balanced they were, etc. We have no idea. I mean, today we have an idea of how to go in that direction, but with the means they had, but we wouldn't be able, with those means, to replicate what they did. We know that for one excellent blade, there would have been other 9 that were so-so, right? Or actually a few pretty bad ones as well. But that's also what you make war with, right? If you are a poor trooper of some sort. Besides, again, this was a universal problem. And we don't even have to think that, again, this top achievements by the Woods still were unique to India. In fact, we have archaeological evidence that indicates that pretty high quality steel was being manufactured in East Africa as early as the 6th century AD. Which may have actually influenced India in the same way. And again, it's complicated always to compare, like, because it's not like we have a full range, as you understand, of archaeological evidence that simply tells us, you know, how qualitative the average blade in India or East Africa or whatever was at this time, in this point in history. Century by century, let's say. But we have indicators that surely things, say, get developed sort of in the more advanced civilizations and are the ones that have greater reason just to develop that for that matter. I don't know, if you look at Damascus steel, for example, it's also in many ways just a name. Right. Sometimes it depends also that there were other countries who were historically famous for having, if anything, for example, more iron, right? Not necessarily even the better armor in that sense. So it depends on what we're discussing, how also this is distributed or not. But you understand that Syrian warfare, as we described this during the Crusades, was fairly advanced, especially in urban militias. They probably had the best ones in the Islamic world at the time. Maybe India could have been an exception, but we know too few about that. But it's not like they were, you know, I mean, the Syrian warfare was particularly remembered because, I don't know, they had blades with which they cut people in half, even with armor, something like that. This is just one factor. we know that warfare was, again, relatively homogeneous at the time, technologically speaking. We just appreciate that the Indians were surely not less developed in metallurgy than, say, the Syrians in that sense. Within India, the use of archaic terminology, by the way, may have obscured changes in the weapons themselves. We know it pretty well that specific terms are meant to be generic. We are looking at pre-Linnean, pre-modern, probably, cultures, places. They didn't care about specifying all the various technical details about a weapon. That also would have been, generally speaking, not particularly different from one you could find elsewhere. But that mostly was conceptualized in the sources, as we said before, as something, for example, more symbolic or more traditional. Plus, again, India does not have even that overwhelming amount of chronicling, say, narrative, documentary tradition compared, at least, to, for example, other cultures. Only where Persian terms were adopted can developments be readily identified, because we have much better documentation in the West. The same issue applies to the pictorial record. Right, when you look again, all the pictures I inserted here, say, was this Middle Ages? Or it's a weird Middle Ages compared to the Middle Ages that I know, not just from European art, but say, I don't know, Middle Eastern art. They are, in fact, are fairly similar. Hindu-Indian art was highly conservative instead, and again, there is a specific cultural reason. In part, this does correspond to the fact that Indians were not so, as a whole, overwhelmingly, say, qualitatively developed as Western Eurasians at large. However, even, say, some of the magnificent monuments that you can admire here, that we'll get a bit also in the depths of in the part about the iconographic, the archaeological evidence, definitely show us that a lot of wealth, like lots of resources, and an obvious need to idealize, to conform to specific religious and cultural models. And again, so things that barely resemble as a sort of a more realistic approach to art, to iconography in particular. Nevertheless, the high reputation of Indian swords, as we were saying before, in ancient Arabia, for example, seems to have endured justifiably or otherwise throughout the early Islamic era. The classic early medieval Indian sword featured a straight double-edged blade, which is of Iranian tradition. There is no doubt about that. So by Iranian, I also mean, for example, like something could have stemmed from the continuous waves of Indo-European conquerors at some point in its history. An interesting characteristic of these blades is that sometimes they were broadened towards the tip. This actually indicates some kind of more chopping capacity, probably because the wider amount of Indian infantrymen were so poorly equipped. So you needed something that reached far through the blade, that also was necessary to evidently clash against some armor, but it could simply chop like at the extremities without losing the breadth, right? You would say, but that indicates that maybe it didn't belong to the Turco-Mongol saber tradition exactly, but that has nothing to do with, for example, the greater or lesser development of cavalry culture. On the contrary, like if these types of swords remained at that time in Indian warfare, it is likely because their cavalry, as I was hypothesizing before, was in individual terms heavier than it had before. Like, you know that also in the Islamic world, we made multiple videos, for example, about Syrian, Iraqi warfare. At the beginning of this period, say the 11th century, the normal type of sword there was still of the Iranian tradition. I mean, the Arabs, as well, of the early Islamic conquest, basically got most of their hardware and also an idea of holy war and etc., also iconography from Persia, right? From Persian military culture that also, as we've seen in India, is so even close as well. And And it's not, in fact, until the Seljuk takeover that you really start seeing more curved blades, right? And there is also, as we were saying before, a broader reason, which is the exhaustion of some sort of more orderly and bulkier level of sort of heavy cavalry. In this more sedentary areas of Islam, we could discuss how this is the case, but let's say we're looking at the elite cavalry of the Indian war is more sort of feudally oriented than the Islamic one before the conquest. That would have been the model. It's as if you had these words, for example, were with a straight blade, were typical of the Khwarezmian tradition. Because regardless of the Turkic injections, the Iranian tradition had been basically maintained in material culture, and especially the need to serve a specific knight, right? It's as if this were the descendants of cataphracts, ideally, regardless of how armored they were, right? It was a more compactly knightly type of warfare, whereas the Turco-Mongol world is basically underdeveloped. It stems from an incredibly primitive reality where you have basically the elite that is really ultra elite to an extent, and then lots of broken subjects that have been stripped of the heavier gear, etc., and serve as horse archers, and as such tend to use sabers more because they tend to fight sort of more with hit and run tactics, and that is the better sword, which also for that, which naturally entails a weakness, a lightness, and that in fact requires actually less training than the straight sword. So again, the elite Hindu horsemen would have likely followed that sort of broader Iranian tradition, and here is rather just like the Islamic element that is, especially after the 11th century, more like Turco-Mongolic in nature, that sort of represents that side of the story. Again, coupled that with the fact that India was heavily sedentary and that, yes, it had already steppes influence, but in general, they were either from, again, times where the Iranian model was on, but also that counted also on elephant warfare, on really enormous amounts of infantrymen as well. So this cavalry maybe felt too much sheltered, they were maybe too heavy, too unwieldy, and so they didn't fare better compared sort of with the hungrier and angrier Turco-Mongols from the steppes. It's a matter of moral force, right? It's as if the Indians had been the more soft and gentrified element, and this Turco-Iranians were a bit too, instead more aggressive, more up to a fight, but probably more motivated for conquest. Reverse curved swords existed as well, but these were smaller, some sort of almost dagger type. This is quite tellingly a more common type of weapon in southern India than in the north. And this is readily explained. Again, the knights of the north would have really needed this, much longer blades with the bar center shifted towards the top for maximizing the effect on horseback, whereas the southerners were more like hit and run in tactics. They also had less cavalry to begin with. They would have preferably ambushed like sort of the greater foes of the north. Again, in between, I'm simplifying, but that's the tendency. Like in between, you would have had a lot of mixes. This weapon is at least would become known later as the Sosum Pata, meaning the lily leaf, which also has this chthonic symbolism attached to it, more like not much as something Apollonian in nature, but really stemming as a poisonous thing, like from the crawling underworld. This may have also been the forefather of the later so-called kibert knife. We have references in Indian texts suggesting that ordinary troops often used large daggers rather than full-size swords. And these smaller weapons likely included the reverse curved variety, right? There were also some things like machetes of some sort that likely were sort of a compromise, some sort of chopping weapon. Naturally cost so much that the majority of Indian infantrymen would have been spearmen of some sort. Blades did cost even in sort of later medieval times. So there would have been also towards the later Middle Ages a tendency to professionalization, to oligarchization of warfare, just like in the rest of Eurasia. So at that point, most of any sort of commoners' infantry that would have been probably great and important, say between the 12th and the early 14th century, just like again in the rest of Eurasia, would have lost much of its importance. We don't have, however, to underestimate these guys. Again, blades are also sometimes symbolical. Again, the iconography can be tricky. But these weapons existed and they suggest some, again, chopping capacity. These larger daggers would have been, by the way, more tendentially single-edged, differently from the knightly swords that were double-edged, according especially to the Iranian tradition. The traditional Indian bow, as we mentioned it before, was considered outdated by some scholars, in particular because it was counterposed to the composite bows used by the invaders. This is debatable for a number of reasons. Like, I don't know, we can look at the increase in importance in bows and even in long bows in the later Middle Ages elsewhere. And again, Indian society is a bit different from the European one, so you wouldn't have quite the same type of, I don't know, sense of identity and pride that, I don't know, an English longbowman could be as an Anglo-Saxon, as from his common law and the general, bond that existed between him and the crown in a particular time of English history that, however, is a bit an exception in the rest of European warfare. Surely as we've seen before regarding the cooptation of some lower estaters to general posts, some Indian princes would have actually tried to counter the nobility through the enactment of some military reforms, or at least to the unlocking of certain posts, as we've seen, and probably also just numbers of troops from the lower estates. Certain Indian powers were pretty big, by the way, so we will perhaps not address this today in the specifics, because again, I will make more videos about this in particular. However, let's say when we look at the takeover of the Turco-Iranians, of the Muslims, we don't have to think as, first of all, they simply took over everything. If so, they did it nominally also because some Hindus basically decided to accept a decentralized position, enjoying some autonomy, so basically continuing the way they would have always ruled and lived, right? It's not the bow, right? That's the point I made also in the recent series about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War. A bow is just like a secondary weapon, a missile one. It doesn't change the equation, right? You will always have that, first of all, whether it's this bow or another. And again, it's not this that made the difference. It's mostly a matter of moral force. It's of politics, of strategy, even at the bigger, say, above the strictly technical and material level. Besides, as I was recalling before, the Indians had longbows, even at a pretty widespread level, numerically speaking, right? This was a simple bow, often crafted from bamboo, measuring, however, up to 2 meters in length, and sometimes elaborately decorated. Indian iconography is full of this stuff since antiquity, and it's not just a random symbolism. Some art is also pretty realistic, and we understand it's also pretty technical, especially when some non-heroes wield these weapons. Again, this just like as the English longbowman would have not made the difference just per se, but when you think about masses of Indian longbowmen, right, in open field, practicing like this, mostly we can imagine like power kind of shooting, you would have had always to think like how could and would other enemies respond, right? This doesn't end too well, even when you compare it to like for somebody that's shooting from horseback, right? It is true that this is, for example, I would say, because we should look much more into politics. Why didn't the Mongols invade India at large? Again, it's not because of the bamboo longbows, but at large, if you think about that, if this was also relying, all these types of warfare were relying on important missile exchanges, well, finding this kind of foot enemies standing from, again, a firm position, etc., with these powerful weapons, it would have not been too great to be exposed to that. You can, again, say that the Indians had less cohesion, that at the end of the day, they gave ground. Sure, you can easily defeat them in this way, again, beyond any kind of technical element. But it's still not just like a walk in the woods, right? And I would say that Indian history and politics in those centuries reflects the fact that, again, you can even take over large swathes of India, namely, but how long does that actually last? Because it doesn't actually last too long. Dynasties are overthrown. It's not that this, again, it's just like the Muslims are overthrown by the Hindus. That's not how it works. But it's more like a blend. It's more like a synchrosis. It's not just like, I don't know, one system was basically opposed to another, and it was just like an iron-fisted rule all over India just by these conquerors simply parked themselves there, and it was it, right? In some ways, it was that impositive. But in others, it required a lot of compromise with locals, which was basically the only way to rule anywhere. By the way, these longbows were sometimes elaborately decorated, showing that, again, there may be a redundance even in a too highly crafted weapon. It's not just used by a desperate person. In that context, that would have pertained also to the nobility in part. But the bow is important for Indian culture. If you think about Arjuna's archery skills, you realize how deeply important that stuff was, just even ideal. And the bow in the East in general has some greater meaning than in the West. It could even be that this reliance on the bow showed actually a lack of strong, heavy infantry, which may also have been the broader point of it all. These were mostly just retinues of the great noblemen that lacked, however, some stronger element to simply stop, combine arms, combine cavalry arms by some more, as we've seen, desperately, routinely trained people. That's how it happens, in fact, in many circumstances. And again, the system absorbs rather than being simply taken over, right? Without mentioning that composite bows were known in India long before the 11th century as well. And again, the connections with the steppes was key there. They had possibly been introduced by the Sakas in the early centuries AD, but likely they existed also from earlier times, which also makes you think on why they would have not eventually adopted that, even if it wasn't about the bow technology all in all, but just the broader military system that it would preferably employ, which is another story, right? Those had been, the Indo-Scythians had been the winners back in the day as well, but did India change? No, right? So it's just like, I don't know, there are other examples in history of, you get bitten by people that uses a certain weapon, you keep using your own, and this is also what, generally speaking, the broader system keeps doing. So at that point, you can't quite think that that was the point. It's been also noticed, of course, how we were talking about it before, India's generally hot and humid climate meant that fully composite bows required at least waterproofing before they could be widely adopted to begin with. So this would have created a problem to the conquerors initially. The weapons would have been used anyway. Look at what the Mongols did in Indo-China or in the Rus, right? The myth that it rains so you can't use the bows. It's just literally not knowing the ABC that every archer has very specific ways to isolate bowstrings from humidity. And in this sense, it may be that actually the type of further feudalization or privatization of the system that was occurring during the surge also of Islamic influence was mostly, let's say, also indicating maybe an increase again in that lighter cavalry element that would allow for, again, the adoption of the horse archery mostly. And so the composite bow with that, given that mostly stem from the steppe tradition, right? And so we can apparently trace, in fact, a definitive spread of this technology, the composite bow, say between the 12th to the 13th centuries, which makes a lot of sense because it's also the peak of that kind of feudalization and of sort of mounting performing force, because you have to think that even the Indians would have basically enhanced these weapons on their own. It's not just like they liked external foreign enemies or mercenaries to simply prompt them to do so. They would have simply developed this stuff on their own, following those societal and cultural needs more than anything else. Even then, by the way, the traditional Indian practice of adorning bows with gilding, tinsel, and tassels persisted. Other medieval weapons included specialized light javelins. This is also particularly relevant, used from elephant back. This indicates actually an equally anti-elephant purpose, telling the truth, and or probably a type of combat that entailed throwing these javelins from like elephant top to elephant top. Javelins, by the way, are also, like, these are fairly light javelins, but they do have important anti-armor function in a way. It's it also shows how this combat would have been pretty bloody, like at close range, rather than something more range, let's say, with simple bows that would have still been used from elephant back, so to say. Again, we don't know too much, but most of the evidence does show us javeliners rather than archers. There was also an exceptionally long spear called the tomara, which was the Malay equivalent of this elephant-mounted combat. In any case, there was a whole array of weapons, including the simplest ones such as slings and staff slings, which had been a thing in Indian warfare since ancient times to an important degree. Possibly they had some kind of anti-elephant function as well, to annoy the beast, to hit especially the skull or something. But that also reflect an important use in siege warfare, right? And this is, like, again, we will talk at some point more thematically about, medieval Indian siege warfare or something like that. We know, by the way, that the Indians had a fairly advanced polyursetics, right? We don't see something so dramatically advanced like, broader, let's say, the same level of, for example, trebuchet development compared to Western Eurasia. But that also can be, first of all, it's relatively debatable, but it also depends on the areas of India we look at. But again, we don't often see this. Even the iconography, first of all, that was all in wood, basically. The iconography is a bit silent about this, because it was not just something that fits the broader Vedic symbolic art, and it could simply find no place there. So we understand that, for example, the Arabs were more technologically advanced. We understand the Europeans were more technologically advanced. We understand the Chinese were more technologically advanced. But we shouldn't probably think that, because India is also pretty big, and some areas are actually underdeveloped, right? So this is valid also for other areas of the aforementioned cultures. But let's say again, there may be like a giant gap, like in our understanding of Eurasian warfare, when simply realizing that Indian art does not show us as much about warfare, or at least also in realistic terms, as compared to other cultures of the era, right? And for the rest, again, there is this sense of greater, like when you look at Indian art in general, there's something slightly unsettling about it. There is something slightly archaic, primitive in look, and so again, it's understandable to think, as I've always thought myself, really, that Indian warfare was not overall as developed, like as Indian civilization was not overall as developed as the one of the, say, for example, the other great Eurasian civilizations. The reason, again, is also the fact that for how developed certain centers may have been, and aside from the fact the very important regional differences, India at large, as a civilization, remained capable of sustaining itself just through the sheer amount of resources, rather than any specific need to concentrate power at any point in its history. So there are climatic reasons that do actually affect even the moral development to a degree, but not for, say, deterministic reasons just per se, but it's also a matter of, like, I don't know, my father was, for example, very often in Sri Lanka, and of course it's very different from India, but this is the point. I mean, it's the fact that it seems like these people live as if they don't really need to ask or wonder about anything else in the rest of the world. This is actually very typical of all non-Westerners that are basically just looking at where, like, the dirt they step on, rather than thinking that there may be something sort of bigger. So actually, civilizationally speaking, this is not a compliment at all, right? So my idea here is overall that there is probably, as I can see, by the way, from the same iconography, a pretty prepotent cavalry warfare, in my opinion. Surely cavalried by infantry, again, a pretty complex military system, but the thing we may have dramatically underestimated in Indian warfare is its cavalry capacity. And again, it would have been contained also in numbers, etc., so that also explains a lot, and would have, in a sense, also mirrored that sort of, can say simply lawless, but again, very difficult to power concentrate political efforts. Lots of large estates owners simply being out there on their own, pursuing their individual feuds, even without too much of a broader framework. It's mostly the lack of the form at the top that renders you perplexed about India, more than else. So I think that's a key to interpreting medieval Indian warfare, and also not just the one of that era. Today we just talked a fraction of what we're going to look at for this series, because Indian warfare is big, as much as the subcontinent, and I think I'm going to make like 3 videos about this or something. I think it's a bit due, considering the size of the topic, and I can again, intersperse this in sort of different videos at a point, not to be too repetitive, but it's one of those topics we really can cover, but just in a specific timeline, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.